Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to jump right in today and unpack a pretty provocative argument, one that says there's a huge double standard at play in American justice. We're going to break down exactly how this case is made, piece by piece.
So, we're looking at the thesis from political commentator Victor Davis Hanson, and his whole point is this. He believes there's a shifting set of rules being applied to political protests and law enforcement, depending on who's doing the protesting. And this, he says, creates a profound double standard.
So, how does he build this case? Well, he draws a series of really direct comparisons. He puts the events of January 6th right up against recent protests in Minnesota, and his argument is that the principles applied to each one are just completely inconsistent. All right, let's dive in and see what he means.
All right, so first up, Hanson kicks off his whole argument by looking at the people involved, specifically how individuals from two different events were portrayed in public. He's basically saying their stories were shaped entirely by politics, not by some consistent set of principles.
So on one hand, you've got Ashley Babbitt. Hanson points out she was a 14-year military veteran who, in his view, committed a misdemeanor, and he argues she was completely demonized. But then, on the other hand, he points to the Minnesota protesters who resisted federal ICE officers. He says they were practically canonized, turned into martyrs. For Hanson, this is Exhibit A for how narratives can become total polar opposites, all depending on the political winds.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Hanson takes this exact same lens and applies it to the law enforcement officers involved in these situations. He's arguing that the standards for things like transparency and even protection are just completely unequal.
He asks a simple question. Why was the identity of Officer Byrd from January 6th kept under wraps for months, shielded, he says, by both the government and the media? Meanwhile, the officers in Minneapolis, their names were put out there, and he claims they were even targeted by doxing attempts. To him, this just screams a selective, inconsistent approach to officer anonymity. And the argument doesn't stop there. It then extends to weapons, and what Hanson sees as a major double standard on firearms at these demonstrations. He's basically suggesting that the very definition of an armed protest seems to change depending on who's protesting.
Think about it. He claims there was this huge, widespread outrage about January 6th being an armed insurrection, even if just one person might have been armed. But then you look at the Minnesota protests, he says it was seen as perfectly okay for a protester to be walking around openly carrying what he describes as a military-era semi-automatic weapon with extra clips. The contrast, in his view, is pretty stark.
Okay, let's keep going. Hanson builds on this idea by moving to what he sees as maybe the biggest inconsistency of all. What actually happens, legally, to people who assault federal officers?
Yeah, this is where his argument really comes into focus, right, on this divergence in justice. He points to the more than 400 felony convictions handed out for assaulting officers on January 6th, and he puts that right next to the situation in Minneapolis, where he claims that similar attacks on ICE officers were actually cheered on, and he predicts, hey, no arrests are going to follow. Two very different outcomes, he says.
And just to really hammer home his point about narrative versus what he sees as reality, Hanson takes on a big one. He directly challenges the number of officers reportedly killed by protesters during January 6th.
So he argues that this popular narrative, that officers were killed by protesters, is just misleading. He flat out claims no officers were. He says, look, one officer had a stroke the next day, and tragically others later died by suicide. And he contrasts all the intense focus on that with what he sees as a total lack of concern for the federal ICE officers who were attacked and injured in Minneapolis.
Okay, so finally, Hanson zooms out. He broadens his argument beyond just these specific events. He goes for the big picture, claiming there's been a complete flip-flop on a core American legal principle. That is, the balance of power between the states and the federal government.
And this right here really illustrates his core point. He takes us back to 2010, right? The Obama administration sued Arizona over its immigration law, and the argument was all about federal supremacy. But today, he says, you see the very same side defending Minnesota's right to obstruct federal law enforcement, essentially championing the exact states' rights position they used to condemn. It's a complete 180 in his view.
And he doesn't pull any punches here. He goes so far as to frame this whole reversal as a kind of return to a historical states' rights argument. He even labels it a neo-Confederate movement, and he tries to tie it all the way back to what he calls the Democratic Party's original form.
So when you boil it all down, Hanson's core argument is this. These aren't just a bunch of random, isolated inconsistencies. No, he contends they're actually evidence of a strategy.
a strategy where core principles become totally fluid and are just adjusted based on whatever is politically useful in that moment.
So, we've just unpacked Victor Davis Hanson's argument, piece by piece, exactly as he presents it in his commentary, and it really leaves us with a final big question to think about. What happens to public trust in our institutions when the rules of the game seem to be constantly changing?